As we all know, the past couple of weeks, the past month, we've been going through our journey with Jesus on the cross, towards the cross, trying to learn more about what Jesus actually went through. Now, on Sunday, next Sunday, it's Easter Sunday, so it's a Resurrection Sunday where we actually will learn about the resurrection of Jesus. And on Friday, it's going to be a Good Friday service. Now, I know some of you won't be here for the Good Friday service because Good Friday is not an English service, it's an Indonesian service. But Sunday, please come, it's an English service. So today we'll be taking a look at Jesus' death on the cross and what the crucifixion means for us today. So let us open up to Mark chapter 15. And we're going to read, let's see. Well, the sermon today will be focused on verses 21 to 32. But I want us, all of you guys actually, yourselves, to read with the people around you, just the whole of Mark chapter 15, from verses 1 to everything. No, sorry. Yes, to everything. So can you guys read the whole chapter 15 together with the people around you? Mark chapter 15. Read Mark chapter 15 with the people around you. Mark chapter 15. You can just read it to 41 actually. And try to really understand what's happening in the passage. Hopefully that was enough time. But it's okay if you don't, because we're still going to go through it together later on. Today's sermon is going to focus mostly on chapter 15, verse 21 to 32, but we're going to conclude by having a big overview of what's actually happening in the passage. So, first of all, there's two things that we can learn from the crucifixion story for us today. Number one is we need to be willing to suffer. We need to be willing to suffer. I'm taking this from verses 21 to 26. Now, in verses 21 to 26, we are introduced to a new character called Simon. This Simon is not Peter. There is another guy called Simon Peter, but this Simon is a completely different Simon that is first introduced here. And Simon was probably a member of the church later on. That's probably why Mark included it. And also his sons, Alexander and Rufus. So we can just imagine how when Alexander and Rufus, when they were listening to the Gospel of Mark with their fellow believers, they're hearing about their awesome dad who carried the cross with Jesus. What an honor. But anyways, Simon, he's walking around and he is forced to carry the cross with Jesus. Now, the trip from where they were leaving towards Golgotha, or Skull's Head, we don't actually know how long it would have taken. But we do know that it would have taken much longer than expected. Because usually, what happened to people who were going to get crucified in the Roman world was that Roman soldiers would force the victim to carry the cross and deliberately go the long way to publicly humiliate the criminal. And so Jesus, as well as Simon, were both forced to carry this cross to Golgotha. The cross, apparently, based on historical evidence, would have weighed somewhere around 50 to 70 kilos. Now, keep in mind, it's not just a barbell. It's like a cross. It's like that, but much bigger and much heavier. It's not easy. If you guys have ever helped someone move houses, it's not easy to hold weird objects, even though they're only 40 kilos or 30 kilos. But when something's 70 kilos, that's heavy. It's not lightweight. It's not lightweight. And keep in mind, Jesus was tortured before this. He was beaten, and he probably did not have anything to eat. So you can imagine how heavy this cross would have been. Very heavy. So Simon and Jesus, they're suffering, holding this cross together, walking towards death's head, and it's probably uphill as well. And you guys know uphill walking is not easy. With a cross, that's even harder. They probably would have dropped it a couple of times, picked it up again. They were suffering. It was also common to strip criminals naked before the cross, before they get crucified. And so Jesus actually would have been probably naked on the cross because Roman soldiers would have ripped the clothes off and continued to humiliate Jesus. Now keep in mind, when you're up on the cross, you're not just hanging. It hurts a lot. And not only that, but everyone can see you. Your close friends and family and friends. Beaten, tortured, people throwing bad words at you. Your family and friends can all see that. As Christians, we need to understand that the suffering that Jesus experienced throughout his life and ultimately his death on the cross, suffering is not something that we as Christians can avoid. Today, we live in a world, especially in Australia, we live in a culture and a society that wants to remove any kind of suffering, any kind of hardships. Do we agree? I mean, who here actually likes suffering? No one. Who likes hardships? No one. Even at the gym, when we talk about no pain, no gain, when we're in the pain period, it doesn't really feel good, does it? So, we live in a culture that really hates suffering. We are so removed from hardships. We don't like pain, we don't like suffering, we don't like hardships. We want to live easy lives. And so, we take extreme measures for our finances, so we don't need to be financially concerned. We take great measures for our health, so that we don't need to be concerned about any health hardships. We take great measurements in our relationships with one another, so that we don't experience any hardships with people. We live in a culture and society that does not like hardship and suffering. But disciples of Jesus are expected to not remove suffering from their lives or to remove themselves from suffering, but to actually live faithful lives in the midst of suffering. As Christians and followers of Jesus, we are actually called to not remove ourselves from suffering, but to live faithfully in the midst of suffering. And so if we as Christians think to ourselves, I don't want to live a difficult life. I don't want to live a life of hardships. I don't want to do difficult things. It's not going to be easy to be a follower of Jesus. To be a follower of Jesus was never an easy task that anyone could achieve. The call to follow Jesus in many countries also means that you're willing to die tomorrow or even today. In many countries in the world today, if you are a Christian, you get killed. The call of being a follower of Jesus is a call to a life of suffering. But on the other hand, for those who do or who are willing to suffer for the sake of Jesus, for the people who are willing to go through intense hardships for the sake of Jesus, Jesus promises us that we will experience glory. Now, not only is it honorable for us to suffer with Jesus, but Paul in Romans chapter 8 verse 17, he says, "Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory." So for Christians, and for Paul especially, whenever Paul he talks about suffering, he always talks about glory as well. Paul always says Christians are going to suffer, but also know that if you suffer for Christ, you will also experience glory with him. If you suffer for Christ, you'll also share in his glory. And the early Christians, they well understood that suffering was something that they had to experience and go through. And many Christians considered it a great honor to suffer for Jesus' sake. There's actually a certain church tradition, which probably is true. You guys know Peter, right? The guy who denies Jesus 3 times. Well, in church tradition, apparently what happened was that Peter was going to get crucified. But Peter said to the Roman soldiers, "Please don't crucify me the same way as Jesus. I'm not worthy enough to die on the cross in the same way." So guess what he did? He said, "Crucify me upside down." We need to understand that in the early church traditions, suffering for the sake of Christ was considered an honor. And I think that's something that we have lost in the Western world, because we see suffering as such an evil, bad thing that we should avoid at all costs. But suffering for the sake of Jesus is an expectation and also an honor. Now, of course, I'm not saying go out to the world and intentionally seek out suffering. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying deliberately put yourselves in situations where you know you're going to suffer. But what I am saying is that when Christians, when we do experience suffering, our instinctive response shouldn't be, okay, how can I get rid of it? But rather, it should be, how can I be faithful in the midst of suffering? When we are going through hardships in life, don't think to yourselves, how can I remove the hardships? But think to yourselves, how can I be faithful in the midst of hardships? And Jesus is someone who displays that. In the middle of all his suffering leading up to the cross and also his crucifixion, he had every opportunity to leave, to remove himself from the suffering, but he didn't. He was faithful in the midst of suffering. And as Christians, we have to have a better understanding of suffering. Don't walk away and try to remove all suffering from your lives, but think about, how can I be faithful? How can I reflect God's image in the midst of suffering? The second thing that we can learn from today's passage is we need to be willing to be humble. The crucifixion story teaches us that we need to be willing to be humble. Like I mentioned before, when Jesus was put up on the cross, he was most likely naked. He was tortured. He was beaten. People sweared at him. People said bad things to him. And his family and friends, his loved ones, would have all seen this happening live. I mean, how embarrassing would that be for you? It is such a humiliation. Crucifixion, being crucified, it was the Romans, they saw it as the most humiliating death to go through. Dying's fine, but being crucified is not. That's how they viewed it. Because to be crucified was to experience such shame and humiliation. And we all know that Jesus is powerful. Jesus is extremely powerful. We've seen throughout the Gospels that he could calm the storms. He could walk on water. He even says in the Gospel of Luke, I can summon 12 legions of angels to come and protect me. He can do all these powerful things, and he has, proven that he is powerful. But in the midst of all this humiliation that he faced, he remained humble. Now, the Greek understanding, the Greek word for humility or being humble, it doesn't just mean I'm humble. It doesn't mean that. What it basically means is that even though you have the strength and power to destroy someone, you withhold that strength. That's what it means to be humble in the Greco-Roman understanding. Even though I have the power and strength to destroy someone, I choose to withhold. For example, when you're playing Uno and you have 4 plus 4 cards, you're like bam, 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 When you're playing against your little siblings, and you play with the rule that, you can end with power cards, you won. You got the 4 plus 4 cards. To be humble in the Greco-Roman understanding means to not do that. To not spam the plus 4s. To withhold your strength and power. And we all know what this feels like to be humble in times of humiliation. When people when people treat you badly, or when people speak badly of you, or when people do something to you, you have this thought that instinctively we think to ourselves, oh, if I say this person is going to get destroyed. Or if I do this, I can ruin this person's life. I'll be honest, we've all had those thoughts in our minds. When we face great humiliation, oh, if only I did this. If only I would do this. That wrathful, angry mindset. We all have experienced that. But to be humble within that context means to not do that. To not lash out. To not abuse the power and strength that you have. That is what it means to remain humble. And that is what Jesus did. In the midst of such humiliation, Jesus remained humble. And that is the model that we are to live out as well. As God's image bearers, when people are, as we learned last week, when people treat us badly, we have to view them not as our enemies. Because at the end of the day, our true enemies are not other human beings made in the image of God, but the dark powers of evil working behind the scenes. And so when people do treat us badly, as Jesus displayed in today's story, we need to remain humble. And it's not just humble for the sake of being humble. Jesus remained humble in obedience to God. And that is the mentality and perspective that we need to have as well. In obedience to God, I am choosing willingly to be humble. So that's the second thing that we learn from today's story. We need to be willing to be humble. So from the crucifixion story, of course, there are so many things that we can learn. But practically, I think those are 2 things that we can clearly see. The number 1, we need to be willing to suffer for the sake of Jesus. And number 2, we need to be willing to be humble. But I think there's a greater story a greater lesson that we can actually see from the whole of chapter 15, or specifically from verses 16 to 41. This is so interesting. You guys have to know this. It's going to be helpful for what I say later. So, in the Greco-Roman world, whenever the Roman emperor or a very high general would defeat an enemy nation in war, when they came back to Rome, when they came back to the main city or the main town, there would be a celebration. And the celebration for the victorious general or victorious emperor had 8 different steps. Now, what's really interesting is that as we read Mark chapter 15, Mark writes Jesus going to the cross, Jesus' lead up to the cross, as if that he was a Roman emperor who was victorious over enemy nations. Let me explain. So, 8 steps to celebrate a Roman general, a Roman emperor's victory over enemy nations. Number 1, what happens? In the Roman world, once the emperor returns home, the Roman guards would go meet the victorious emperor early in the morning. In the Gospel of Mark, at the very beginning, in verse 16, what do we see? Roman guards meet with Jesus, and this would have been taking place early in the morning. The second thing that happens in the Roman world, Roman guards would put on a victory robe and place do you guys know what a laurel is? A crown made out of laurel, a laurel crown. It's like, you know how whenever we think of Caesar, there's that green thing on his head? Look like leaves? Yeah. They'll place that crown onto the emperor and then perform acts of homage, acts of respect to the emperor. When we see the Gospel of Mark in chapter 15, what do we see? The Roman guards put on a purple robe on Jesus. Now, purple signifies royalty. And they put not a crown of laurel, but a crown of thorns on Jesus' head. And then Mark says they proceed to give acts of homage by beating Jesus. Number 3, the Roman guards would lead the Roman emperor through the streets of the city with a sacrificial victim that will be sacrificed later. And it was usually a prisoner of war from the enemy nations. And then the official of the emperor would carry an implement that would be used to sacrifice or to kill the sacrificial victim. In the Gospel of Mark, what do we see? The Roman guards lead Jesus through the streets of the city. And Jesus acts both as emperor and also the sacrificial victim. He's going to be the one who dies. And then Simon comes out, acting as the official of Jesus, and carries the implement that will be used to kill Jesus, the cross. Number 4, the Roman guards will end the walk with the emperor at a place called Death's Head, and this will be the place where the sacrifice is taking place. In the Gospel of Mark, what do we see? Jesus is taken to a place called Golgotha, which means place of skull, which could also be translated as Death's Head, ready to be crucified. In the Roman world, the emperor is then offered ceremonial wine, but he intentionally pours it out on the altar where the sacrifice will be taking place. In this gospel, what do we see? Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, but what does he do? He rejects it. Number 6, the Roman emperor is lifted up before the people, and people shout praises, and there'll be 2 vice regents standing next to the emperor. What do we see in Mark's gospel? Jesus is lifted up by being crucified, and who's next to him? 2 criminals. And then the people start giving shouts of insults. Number 7, the Roman guards start praising the emperor again, and then everyone else follows. In the Gospel of Mark, what do we see? The guards, chief priests, and teachers of the law shout insults, and everyone else around them follows. And finally, this is probably the most significant, number 8. The victory ceremony is concluded when there is a sign from the heavens by the gods, the Roman gods. And that sign would be when someone says, "Truly, this is the Son of God." The Son of God phrase was always used on the emperor. Why? The emperor is the most closest to the Roman gods. Therefore, the Roman emperor is an ambassador of the gods. And so when this celebration, when this victory celebration was concluded, it was concluded by someone saying, truly this is the Son of God. Now, what do we see right after Jesus dies on the cross? The Roman centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. Now, this is not coincidence. Any reader of Mark's gospel would have fully known that Mark was intentionally writing Jesus' crucifixion story as if he was a victorious emperor defeating the enemy nations. In the Roman world, when they would have seen Jesus, they would have seen Jesus as a failure, an embarrassment, a shame, and definitely not a king, because he died on the cross. And as I said before, the crucifixion was the most embarrassing death you could experience. But Mark says otherwise. Mark says that the death and suffering of Jesus is actually the declaration of his victory. Jesus' death and suffering on the cross is a victory of this new king who defeated not the enemy nations, but the true enemy, the powers of evil, death, and sin. So when we as Christians choose to live lives of faithfulness in the midst of suffering and choose to live lives of humility, we're not just doing this because we're good Christians. But when we do this, we are actually publicly declaring the victory of Jesus. Jesus was victorious how? Through his suffering and humiliation. And so when we choose to live faithfully in obedience in the midst of suffering and humiliation, we are declaring that Jesus rose from the dead. So it is not just a matter of we do it because we just do it because we're Christians. But we do it because we are declaring the victory of Christ. I mean, why else would a bunch of people gather like every Sunday and be willing to suffer and experience humiliation for a dead guy called Jesus? I mean, that's total nonsense. Why would anyone do that? Unless the suffering and humiliation and the death of Jesus was actually his victory. So this is an extremely important perspective to have on suffering, on death. As Christians, we need to be willing to experience suffering in our lives. We need to be willing to experience humiliation. And we need to be willing to live lives of faithfulness and obedience in the midst of all these hardships. Because that is primarily the way on how we declare the victory of Jesus. So next time when we are going through suffering, next time when we are facing hardships, next time when we are facing humiliation, the question that we shouldn't be asking is, we shouldn't be asking ourselves, what can I do to remove this suffering? Or what can I do to get myself out of this situation? The better question and the correct question that we ought to be asking is, how can I remain faithful in the midst of this time? Let's pray.